I'm setting my timer to watch to make sure I don't say that. I thought I'd start by introducing myself. So I'm Phil, and hello. I've been listening to The Archers for about 9 years, I think. I was putting it up, and that's like a hell of a lot of my life. But this is probably the strangest thing I've ever done. But funnily enough, it's not the first time I've presented in this room, and I was here in December talking about housing. So outside of my obsession with The Archers, I'm a social researcher where I do lots of research which informs government policy and decision making and things. So I've done work on hidden homelessness, and I've done some work on access to media for people who have sensory impairments and interesting things like that. But before I got into that world, and the world I'm going back to because I quit and I'm moving to go and do a research degree in Australia, is anthropology and psychology, and in that I really focused in on masculinity or masculinities, gender and sexuality, and I kind of married the three interests I've got, and I've ended up here with this, and in putting it together, it doesn't feel like a finished piece. It feels like a starting piece, maybe of a PhD or some sort of research thesis. But to get into it, does literature shape or simply reflect public attitudes? So it definitely reflects, and I was thinking back to English when I was learning about literature and things like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. It's not really about scary monsters, it's kind of about our own fears of technology and technological change. And then similarly, I was talking to my brother who's 13, and he was reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and again, that's something that doesn't just reflect attitudes of a certain time period, but it's helped to shape and inform people about the experiences of people in experiencing racial prejudice and helped shift attitudes in the US and around the world. But to focus in on sexuality, I had a look and I did some reading around Will and Grace, which has popped back up from the past. And there's been a lot of debate and a lot of academic debate around the role of Will and Grace around homosexuality and normalizing that. But there has been studies that have shown that for people who have never met gay people or don't think they've ever met gay people, the show or the exposure to the show has reduced prejudice attitudes. So there's studies that have shown that, which is quite interesting. But that makes sense, and I can never pronounce. I only remember the false pronunciation of this guy's name, who has a famous theory around the mere exposure effect, where it's not Zedong, but it's something like that. But that is that the more you are exposed to something, an idea or people, the less scary it becomes, in essence. And so literature and things like The Archers have a role in reflecting attitudes, but they can also help shape them, like with To Kill a Mockingbird. And again, there's been lots of movements at the moment around representation, and I'm thinking around things like Oscars So White and all of that. But I'm running out of time, so to get into what I did, I really wanted to focus in on The Archers and look at the way in which, or ways in which gender and sexuality are presented in the show, and what that might mean for Britain, and what that might mean for The Archers and Ambridge as a place. So in a play or a drama, there's characters and there's storylines, and with my anthropology background, I went in on characters and wanted to look at characterization. So I tried to get in touch with everyone in Ambridge, but no one answered. So instead, I asked listeners of The Archers how they thought Archers characters or people, villagers in Ambridge would have responded to questions from some attitude studies. So I took a few questions, some from the Fawcett Society and some from the Gay Men's Health Charity that they'd asked in studies. So these are existing UK studies, and I've asked them of listeners how they thought characters would have answered. So what I have, in short, is a measure of audience perceptions of character attitudes, which is quite complex to explain. But what I did was select a range of characters based on age and gender and class. to kind of see how that fell out and married against the UK attitudes. So really quickly, what is gender and what is sex? I mean, there's whole classes on that, but in essence, gender is the socially constructed attributes that relate to being a woman or being a man, so feminine and masculine, and sex is distinct to that and relates to biological features or characteristics, so your body organs and your hormones and things, and they're not the same thing, and you can also, there is also, along with men and women, there's also transgender, which is potentially people who are born in the wrong body or the wrong sex that might identify as another gender. And there's also a spectrum along that, so people who might not identify as man or woman and can sit in between. There's also intersex people who might have different sexual organs as well. So very brief history of transgender representation. Transgender has, as a concept and as a group of people, have enjoyed more representation recently in shows like Orange is the New Black and on Celebrity Big Brother. But I just wanted to make the point and say that they've always been around. So in India there's a class of people or a group of people called Hijra, and there's been concepts and discussions around the third gender for many years. And I just wanted to say that at the start of the queer rights movement, which I'll come to later, at Stonewall, it was queer women of colour or trans women of colour who were there starting the fight. So I'm going to try and rush through that and then slow down on these numbers so you can soak them in. And there's no numbers on the slide, but they are here. So I will talk you through the Fawcett Society studies. So they're a charity who campaign for women's and gender equality. And they did a study of 8,000 people, and they asked a question on people's attitudes towards gender. So there's a split on how people in the UK perceive gender identity, or in Britain. So 56%, so just over half, think that there are two genders, those being male and female. And less than a half, 44%, think that gender can be a range of identities. And within that, that's at a British level, but women take a more fluid view than men, so 48% of women think that gender can be a range of identities compared to only 39% of men. And there's differences in age spectrum as well, so people over 65, it was 65% who saw gender as two categories compared to 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds. And both of those are significantly different from the 56% average. So how did these attitudes, or how did people perceive these attitudes varying across Ambridge? So I asked about a few different characters. So I asked about Will, Susan, Justin, Ed, Jennifer, Kirsty, Pat, Pitt, and I'm not sure what people would think that they would respond, but there was a breadth of views across characters, meaning that listeners thought there would be disagreement in Ambridge on whether there was two categories of gender or a multiplicity of categories or a spectrum. So the interpretation of some characters' views were really consistent. So almost everybody saw Will, Susan, Kirsty, Justin, and Jill as having the same attitude, whereas Ed, Jennifer, Pat, and Pitt were slightly more hard to place. So they were, some people thought they would say one thing, some thought they would say another thing, but there was clear skews either way. I'm wondering if people can guess how that fell out, but Ed, Will, and Justin both lent towards there being two categories of gender, whereas there was a slight lean as well among the over 65, so Jill, Justin, and Jennifer that way as well. Whereas Kirsty was the outlier in the village, what a surprise, who very much was of the belief that there would be multiple genders, and again with Pitt and Pat, sharing those views as well, and that reflects the UK attitudes where there's skews among women towards seeing there as multiple categories, and people over 65 seeing it as being more of a binary two-category thing. So to jump to my gay history lesson, to return back to Stonewall, which was what the riots that started in a New York pub, I can't remember when, but that was really the start. 1961. It was the start of gay liberation, and before then, more and more so, people lived in secret. And this movement and the gay liberation movement, for some people, was an opportunity to kind of redefine how they live their lives, and moving from living in secret to living in new ways, as they didn't have the opportunity to live, or it was much harder to live as a couple or live as a family. And I wanted to ask some questions around that as well. So for some people, this kind of movement was an opportunity to redefine how people wanted to live, so maybe not living in monogamous relationships and not living in couples, and kind of recreating a world that they wanted to live in. So the GMFA, a charity who focus on gay men's health, did a study in 2015 and 16 looking at attitudes to open relationships among gay men. So that being relationships where they're in a committed couple but consensually might see other people. Of what they found was that of men or gay men in couples who had experience of this, they were much more open to it, or much more favourable to open relationships than gay men who were in relationships who hadn't had that. And they asked some attitudes and things, and they found that just under 20% of men think that who had no experience of open relationships thought that it might be a good thing. About 1/3 thought it would be bad. Half of them weren't sure. A third, again, thought that open relationships weren't real relationships. And just over half said they'd rather be single than in an open relationship. And so that's what people said in the UK. And then I wonder how Adam and Ian might have responded, and how Adam and Ian might differ from each other. And as you would expect, people, or maybe you wouldn't expect, but people, listeners perceived Adam as being more open to open relationships than Ian. But the results were really clear for Ian, who everyone thought he would say it would be bad for relationships, not real relationships, and that he'd rather be single than in an open relationship. And I think he did actively make that choice. Whereas Adam, was much more open. Although a lot of people thought that he would think that open relationships can be bad for relationships, probably reflecting on his time in the heartbreak sleep. But essentially, what's really interesting here is that how people perceived Adam and Ian's attitudes broadly aligns with other gay men in the UK who had no experience of being in an open relationship. So, just about on time. What can we learn from this? As someone who does a lot of research methods, for me, next time, it's ask more about more characters, because that will give a wider view. And there's also an interesting question around whether when people were responding to these questions, were they really reflecting their own values onto characters, which would be interesting to explore. But I think it's fair to say that the characterization in the Archers, as we've seen, does reflect a variety of views, and that kind of seems to broadly align with views in the UK, but there is a lack of representation in storylines, we've never had a character who's transgender, and we've not really had gay men in open relationships before. So in summary, for me, I think the personal really is political, and does the Archers shape or portray attitudes to gender and sexuality? It definitely portrays a variation of attitudes, but there's much less of a diversity of experience shown in the Archers. So although there might be a range of attitudes that seem to be within the play and people can interpret that, we're not seeing the experiences of transgender people, and we're not seeing a diversity of experience of gay men or gay people, and they're not really reflective of the kind of numbers you'd see in the UK population of those people. And I would just say that applies as well for intersectionality, so with ethnicity and disability and things as well. But essentially, I think the arches could play a bigger role in normalizing and encouraging people to consider different forms of living or open-mindedness towards people from other gender categories. Thanks.